The Heart of Gold fled on silently through the night of space. Its crew of 4 were ill at ease, knowing that they had been brought together not of their own volition or by simple coincidence, but by some curious perversion of physics, as if relationships between people were susceptible to the same laws that governed the relationships between atoms and molecules. As the ship's artificial night closed in, they were each grateful to retire to separate cabins and try to rationalize their thoughts. Trillian couldn't sleep. She sat on a couch and stared at a small cage which contained her last and only links with Earth, 2 white mice that she had insisted Zaphod let her bring. She had expected never to see the planet again, but she was disturbed by her negative reaction to the news of the planet's destruction. It seemed remote and unreal, and she could find no thoughts to think about it. She watched the mice scurrying round the cage and running furiously in their little plastic treadwheels, till they occupied her whole attention. Suddenly she shook herself and went back onto the bridge to watch over the tiny flashing lights and figures that charted the ship's progress through the void. She wished she knew what it was she was trying not to think about. Zaphod couldn't sleep. He also wished he knew what it was that he wouldn't let himself think about. For as long as he could remember, he'd suffered from a vague, nagging feeling of being not all there. Most of the time he was able to put this thought aside and not worry about it, but it had been reawakened by the sudden inexplicable arrival of Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent. Somehow it seemed to conform to a pattern that he couldn't see. Ford couldn't sleep. He was too excited about being back on the road again. 15 years of virtual imprisonment were over, just as he was finally beginning to give up hope. Knocking about with Zaphod for a bit promised to be a lot of fun, though there seemed to be something faintly odd about his semi-cousin that he couldn't put his finger on. The fact that he had become president of the galaxy was frankly astonishing, as was the manner of his leaving the post. Was there a reason behind it? There would be no point in asking Zaphod. He never appeared to have a reason for anything he did at all. He'd turned unfathomability into an art form. He attacked everything in life with a mixture of extraordinary genius and naive incompetence, and it was often difficult to tell which was which. Arthur slept. He was terribly tired. There was a tap at Zaphod's door. It slid open. Zaphod? Yeah? Trillian stood outlined in the oval of light. I think we just found what you came to look for. Hey, yeah? Ford gave up the attempt to sleep. In the corner of his cabin was a small computer screen and keyboard. He sat at it for a while and tried to compose a new entry for the guide on the subject of Vogons, but couldn't think of anything vitriolic enough, so he gave that up too, wrapped a robe around himself, and went for a walk to the bridge. As he entered, he was surprised to see 2 figures hunched excitedly over the instruments. See, the ship's about to move into orbit, Trillian was saying. There's a planet out there. It's at the exact coordinates you predicted. Zaphod heard a noise and looked up. Ford, he hissed. Hey, come and take a look at this. Ford went and had a look at it. It was a series of figures flickering over a screen. You recognize those galactic coordinates? Said Zaphod. No. I'll give you a clue. Computer? Hi, gang, enthused the computer. This is getting real sociable, isn't it? Shut up, said Zaphod, and show up the screens. Light on the bridge sank. Pinpoints of light played across the consoles and reflected in 4 pairs of eyes that stared up at the external monitor screens. There was absolutely nothing on them. Recognize that? Whispered Zaphod. Ford frowned. No, he said. What do you see? Nothing. Recognize it? What are you talking about? We're in the Horsehead Nebula, one whole vast dark cloud. And I was meant to recognize that from a blank screen. Inside a dark nebula is the only place in the galaxy you'd see a dark screen. Very good. Zaphod laughed. He was clearly very excited about something, almost childishly so. Hey, this is really terrific. This is just far too much. What's so great about being stuck in a dust cloud? Said Ford. What would you reckon to find here? Urged Zaphod. Nothing. No stars? No planets? No. Computer, shouted Zaphod. Rotate angle of vision through 180 degrees and don't talk about it. For a moment it seemed that nothing was happening. Then a brightness glowed at the edge of the huge screen. A red star the size of a small plate crept across it, followed quickly by another one. A binary system. Then a vast crescent sliced into the corner of the picture, a red glare shading away into deep black, the night side of the planet. "I found it!" cried Zaphod, thumping the console. "I found it!" Ford stared at it in astonishment. "What is it?" he said. "That," said Zaphod, "is the most improbable planet that ever existed." Excerpt from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Entry: Magrathea. Far back in the mists of ancient time, in the great and glorious days of the former galactic empire, life was wild, rich, and largely tax-free. Mighty starships plied their way between exotic suns, seeking adventure and reward amongst the furthest reaches of galactic space. In those days, spirits were brave, the stakes were high, men were real men, women were real women, and small furry creatures from Alpha Centauri were real small furry creatures from Alpha Centauri. And all dared to brave unknown terrors, to do mighty deeds, to boldly split infinitives that no man had split before, and thus was the empire forged. Many men, of course, became extremely rich, but this was perfectly natural and nothing to be ashamed of, because no one was really poor, at least no one worth speaking of. And for all the richest and most successful merchants, life inevitably became rather dull and niggly, and they began to imagine that this was therefore the fault of the worlds they'd settled on. None of them was entirely satisfactory. Either the climate wasn't quite right in the later part of the afternoon, or the day was half an hour too long, or the sea was exactly the wrong shade of pink. And thus were created the conditions for a staggering new form of specialist industry, custom-made luxury planet building. The home of this industry was the planet Magrathea, where hyperspatial engineers sucked matter through white holes in space to form it into dream planets, gold planets, platinum planets, soft rubber planets with lots of earthquakes, all lovingly made to meet the exacting standards that the galaxy's richest men naturally came to expect. But so successful was this venture that Magrathea itself soon became the richest planet of all time, and the rest of the galaxy was reduced to abject poverty. And so the system broke down, the empire collapsed, and a long, sullen silence settled over 1 billion hungry worlds. Magrathea itself disappeared, and its memory soon passed into the obscurity of legend. In these enlightened days, of course, no one believes a word of it. Arthur awoke to the sound of argument and went to the bridge. Ford was waving his arms about. "You're crazy, Zaphod," he was saying. "Magrathea is a myth, a fairy story. It's what parents tell their kids about at night if they want to grow up to become economists." "And that's what we're currently in orbit around," insisted Zaphod. "Look, I can't help what you may personally be in orbit around," said Ford, "but this ship—" "Computer!" shouted Zaphod. "Oh no."
"Hi there, this is Eddie, your shipboard computer, and I'm feeling just great, guys. And I know I'm just going to get a bundle of kicks out of any program you care to run through me."
Arthur looked inquiringly at Trillian. She motioned him to come on in, but keep quiet. "Computer," said Zaphod, "tell us again what our present trajectory is."
"A real pleasure, fella," it burbled. "We are currently in orbit at an altitude of 300 miles around the legendary planet of Magrathea."
"Proving nothing," said Ford. "I wouldn't trust that computer to speak my weight."
"I can do that for you, sure," enthused the computer, punching out more ticker tape. "I can even work out your personality problems to 10 decimal places if it'll help."
Trillian interrupted. "Zaphod," she said, "any minute now we'll be swinging round to the daylight side of this planet. Whatever it turns out to be." "Hey, what do you mean by that? The planet's where I predicted it would be, isn't it?" "Yes, I know there's a planet there. I'm not arguing with anyone. It's just that I wouldn't know Magrathea from any other lump of cold rock. Dawn's coming up if you want it." Okay, muttered Zaphod. "Let's at least give our eyes a good time. Computer?"
"Hi there, what can I—"
"Just shut up and give us a view of the planet again." A dark, featureless mass once more filled the screens, the planet rolling away beneath them. They watched for a moment in silence, but Zaphod was fidgety with excitement. Out of the utter blackness stabbed a sudden point of blinding light. It crept up by slight degrees and spread sideways in a thin crescent blade, and within seconds 2 suns were visible, furnaces of light, searing the black edge of the horizon with white fire. The suns blazed into the pitch of space, and a low ghostly music floated through the bridge. Marvin was humming ironically because he hated humans so much. Arthur blinked at the screens and felt he was missing something important. Suddenly he realized what it was. "Is there any tea on this spaceship?" he asked. More of the planet was unfolding beneath them as the Heart of Gold streaked along its orbital path. The suns now stood high in the black sky. The pyrotechnics of dawn were over, and the surface of the planet appeared bleak and forbidding in the common light of day. Grey, dusty, and only dimly contoured, it looked dead and cold as a crypt. "You know, I don't like the look of that planet at all," said Trillian, shivering. "Ah, take no notice," said Zaphod. "With half the wealth of the former galactic empire stored in it, it can afford to look frumpy." "The suspense is killing me," said Arthur testily. Stress and nervous tension are now serious social problems in all parts of the galaxy, and it is in order that this situation should not be in any way exacerbated that the following facts will now be revealed in advance. The planet in question is, in fact, the legendary Magrathea. The deadly missile attack shortly to be launched by an ancient automatic defence system will result merely in the breakage of 3 coffee cups and a mouse cage, the bruising of somebody's upper arm, and the untimely creation and sudden demise of a bowl of petunias and an innocent sperm whale. In order that some sense of mystery should still be preserved, no revelation will yet be made concerning whose upper arm sustains the bruise. This fact may safely be made the subject of suspense, since it is of no significance whatsoever. After a fairly shaky start to the day, Arthur's mind was beginning to reassemble itself from the shell-shocked fragments the previous day had left him with. He'd found a nutrimatic machine which had provided him with a plastic cup filled with a liquid that was almost, but not quite, entirely unlike tea. The way it functioned was very interesting. When the drink button was pressed, it made an instant but highly detailed examination of the subject's taste buds, a spectroscopic analysis of the subject's metabolism, and then sent tiny experimental signals down the neural pathways to the taste centres of the subject's brain to see what was likely to go down well. However, no one knew quite why it did this, because it invariably delivered a cupful of liquid that was almost but not quite entirely unlike tea. The Nutrimatic was designed and manufactured by the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, whose complaints department now covers all of the major land masses of the first 3 planets in the Sirius Tau star system. Arthur drank the liquid and found it reviving. He glanced up at the screens again and watched a few more 100 miles of barren greyness slide past. It suddenly occurred to him to ask a question which had been bothering him. "Is it safe?" he said. "Magrathea's been dead for 5 million years," said Zaphod. "Of course it's safe." At which point a strange and inexplicable sound thrilled suddenly through the bridge, a noise as of a distant fanfare, a hollow, reedy, insubstantial sound. It preceded a voice that was equally hollow, reedy, and insubstantial. The voice said, "Greetings to you." Someone from the dead planet was talking to them. "Computer?" shouted Zaphod.
Hey there!
"What the photon is it?"
Just some 5 million-year-old tape that's being broadcast at us."
"A what? A recording?" "Shush," said Ford. "It's carrying on." The voice was old, courteous, almost charming, but was underscored with quite unmistakable menace. "This is a recorded announcement," it said, "as I'm afraid we're all out at the moment. The Commercial Council of Magrathea thanks you for your esteemed visit." "A voice from ancient Magrathea!" shouted Zaphod. Okay, said Ford. "But regrets," continued the voice, "that the entire planet is temporarily closed for business. Thank you. If you would care to leave your name and the address of a planet where you can be contacted, kindly speak when you hear the tone." A short buzz followed, then silence. They want to get rid of us, said Trillian nervously. What do we do? It's just a recording, said Zaphod. We keep going. Got that, computer?
I got it,
said the computer, and gave the ship an extra kick of speed. They waited. After a second or so came the fanfare once again, and then the voice. We would like to assure you that as soon as our business is resumed, announcements will be made in all fashionable magazines and colour supplements, when our clients will once again be able to select from all that's best in contemporary geography. The menace in the voice took on a sharper edge. Meanwhile, we thank our clients for their kind interest and would ask them to leave now. Arthur looked round the nervous faces of his companions. Well, I suppose we'd better be going then, hadn't we? He suggested. Shh, said Zaphod. There's absolutely nothing to be worried about. Computer, start a descent into the atmosphere and prepare for landing. This time the fanfare was quite perfunctory, the voice now distinctly cold. It is most gratifying, it said, that your enthusiasm for our planet continues unabated, so we would like to assure you that the guided missiles currently converging with your ship are part of a special service we extend to all of our most enthusiastic clients, and the fully armed nuclear warheads are of course merely a courtesy detail. We look forward to your custom in future lives. Thank you. The voice snapped off. Oh, said Trillian. Said Arthur. Well, said Ford. Look, said Zaphod, will you get this into your heads? That's just a recorded message. It's millions of years old. It doesn't apply to us, get it? What about the missiles? Said Trillian quietly. Missiles don't make me laugh. Ford tapped Zaphod on the shoulder and pointed at the rear screen. Clear in the distance behind them, 2 silver darts were climbing through the atmosphere towards the ship. A quick change of magnification brought them into close focus. 2 massively real rockets thundered through the sky. I think they're going to have a very good try at applying to us, said Ford. Zaphod stared at them in astonishment. Hey, this is terrific, he said. Someone down there is trying to kill us. Terrific, said Arthur. But don't you see what this means? Yes, we're going to die. Yeah, but apart from that, it means we must be on to something. How soon can we get off it? Second by second, the image of the missiles on the screen grew larger. They'd swung round now on a direct homing course, so that all that could be seen of them now was the warheads, head-on. What are we going to do? Said Trillian. Just keep cool, said Zaphod. Is that all? Shouted Arthur. No, we're also going to take, evasive action, said Zaphod with a sudden access of panic. Computer, what evasive action can we take?
None, I'm afraid, guys, said the computer. There seems to be something jamming my guidance systems, explained the computer brightly. Impact minus 45 seconds. Please call me Eddie if it will help you relax.
Zaphod tried to run several equally decisive directions simultaneously. Right, he said. We gotta get manual control of this ship. Can you fly her? Asked Ford pleasantly. No, can you? No. Trillian, can you? No. Fine, said Zaphod, relaxing. We'll do it together. I can't either, said Arthur, who felt it was time he began to assert himself. Yeah, I'd guess that, said Zaphod. Okay, computer, I want full manual control now.
You got it,
said the computer. Several large desk panels slid open, and banks of control consoles sprang up out of them, showering the crew with bits of expanded polystyrene packaging and balls of rolled-up cellophane. Zaphod stared at them wildly.
Good luck, guys, chirped the computer. Impact minus 30 seconds.
Ford leapt at the controls. Only a few of them made any immediate sense to him, so he pulled those. The ship shook and screamed as its guidance rocket jets tried to push it every which way simultaneously. He released half of them, and the ship span round in a tight arc and headed back the way it had come, straight towards the oncoming missiles. The ship twisted sharply and rocketed upwards. The crew were hurled violently back across the cabin, and the ship suddenly dropped out of the sky like a stone. It was of course more or less at this moment that one of the crew sustained a nasty bruise to the upper arm. This should be emphasized because, as has already been revealed, they escape otherwise completely unharmed, and the deadly nuclear missiles do not eventually hit the ship. The safety of the crew is absolutely assured.
"Impact minus 20 seconds, guys," said the computer.
"Then turn the bloody engines back on," bawled Zaphod.
"Oh, sure thing, guys," said the computer.
With a subtle roar, the engines cut back in. The ship smoothly flattened out of its dive and headed back towards the missiles again. The two missiles loomed massively on the screens as they thundered towards the ship, but by an extraordinarily lucky chance they'd not yet fully corrected their flight paths to that of the erratically weaving ship, and they passed right under it. The missiles banked round in a screeching arc and plunged back into pursuit. "This is it," said Arthur, watching them. "We are now quite definitely going to die, aren't we?" "I wish you'd stop saying that," shouted Ford. A thought struck Arthur. He struggled to his feet. "Why doesn't anyone turn on this improbability drive thing?" he said. "What, are you crazy?" said Zaphod. "Without proper programming, anything could happen." "Does that matter at this stage?" shouted Arthur. "Does anyone know why Arthur can't turn on the improbability drive?" shouted Trillian. Arthur scrambled up onto one of the excitingly chunky pieces of moulded contouring where the curve of the wall met the ceiling. "I said," yelled Trillian, "does anyone know?" The next thing that happened was a mind-mangling explosion of noise and light. And the next thing that happened after that was that the Heart of Gold continued on its way perfectly normally, with a rather fetchingly redesigned interior. It was somewhat larger, and done out in delicate pastel shades of blue and green. In the centre, a spiral staircase leading nowhere in particular stood in a spray of ferns and yellow flowers. Relaxing in a wickerwork sun chair, Zaphod Beeblebrox said, "What the hell happened?" "Well, I was just saying," said Arthur, lounging by a small fishpool. "There's this improbability drive switch over here." He waved at where it had been. There was a potted plant there now. "But where are we?" said Ford, who was sitting on the spiral staircase, a nicely chilled pan-galactic gargle blaster in his hand. "Exactly where we were, I think," said Trillian, as all about them mirrors suddenly showed them an image of the blighted landscape of Magrathea which still scooted along beneath them. Zaphod leapt out of his seat. "Then what's happened to the missiles?" he said. A new and astounding image appeared in the mirrors. "They would appear," said Ford doubtfully, "to have turned into a bowl of petunias and a very surprised-looking whale."
"At an improbability factor," cut in Eddie, who hadn't changed a bit, "of 8,767,128 to 1 against."
Zaphod stared at Arthur. "Did you think of that, Earthman?" he demanded. "Well," said Arthur, "all I did was—" "That's very good thinking, you know. Hey, kid, you just saved our lives, you know that?" "Oh," said Arthur, "well, it was nothing, really." "Was it?" said Zaphod. "Oh, well, forget it then. Okay, computer, take us into land." "But—" I said forget it. Another thing that got forgotten was the fact that, against all probability, a sperm whale had suddenly been called into existence several miles above the surface of an alien planet. And since this is not a naturally tenable position for a whale, this poor innocent creature had very little time to come to terms with its identity as a whale, before it then had to come to terms with not being a whale anymore. This is a complete record of its thought from the moment it began its life till the moment it ended it. "Ah, what's happening? Excuse me, who am I? Hello? Why am I here? What's my purpose in life? What do I mean by who am I? Calm down, get a grip now. Oh, this is an interesting sensation. What is it? It's a sort of yawning, tingling sensation in my... Well, I suppose I'd better start finding names for things, so let's call it my stomach. And hey, what about this whistling, roaring sound going past what I'm suddenly going to call my head? Perhaps I can call it wind. Is that a good name? It'll do. Perhaps I can find a better name for it later when I've found out what it's for. It must be something very important, because there certainly seems to be a hell of a lot of it. Hey, what's this thing? Let's call it a tail. Yeah, tail. Hey, I can really thrash it about pretty good, can't I? Doesn't seem to achieve very much, but I'll probably find out what it's for later on. Now, have I built up any coherent picture of things yet? No. Never mind. Hey, this is really exciting. So much to find out about. So much to look forward to. I'm quite dizzy with anticipation. Or is it the wind? There really is a lot of that now, isn't there? Oh wow, hey, what's this thing suddenly coming towards me very fast? Very, very fast. So big and flat and round. Needs a big wide sounding name like ow, ound, ground. That's it. That's a good name. Ground. I wonder if it'll be friends with me. And the rest, after a sudden wet thud, was silence. Curiously enough, the only thing that went through the mind of the bowl of petunias as it fell was, "Oh no, not again." Many people have speculated that if we knew exactly why the bowl of petunias had thought that, we would know a lot more about the nature of the universe than we do now. "Are we taking this robot with us?" said Ford, looking with distaste at Marvin, who was standing in an awkward hunched posture in the corner under a small palm tree. Zaphod glanced away from the mirror screens, which presented a panoramic view of the blighted landscape on which the Heart of Gold had now landed. "Oh, the paranoid android," he said. "Yeah, we'll take him." "But what are you supposed to do with a manically depressed robot?" "You think you've got problems," said Marvin, as if he was addressing a newly occupied coffin. "What are you supposed to do if you are a manically depressed robot? No, don't bother to answer that. I'm 50,000 times more intelligent than you, and even I don't know the answer. It gives me a headache just trying to think down to your level." Trillian burst in through the door from her cabin. "My white mice have escaped," she said. An expression of deep worry and concern failed to cross either of Zaphod's faces. "Nuts to your white mice," he said. Trillian glared an upset glare at him and disappeared again. It's possible that her remark would have commanded greater attention had it been generally realized that human beings were only the third most intelligent life form present on the planet Earth, instead of, as was generally thought by most independent observers, the second. "Good afternoon, boys." The voice was oddly familiar, but oddly different. It had a matriarchal twang. It announced itself to the crew as they arrived at the airlock hatchway that would let them out onto the planet's surface. They looked at each other in puzzlement. "It's the computer," explained Zaphod. "I discovered it had an emergency backup personality. I thought it might work out better."
"Now this is going to be your first day out on a strange new planet," continued Eddie's new voice. "So I want you all wrapped up snug and warm, and no playing with any naughty bug-eyed monsters."
Zaphod tapped impatiently on the hatch. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think we might be better off with the slide rule."
"Right," snapped the computer. "Who said that?"
"Will you open up the exit hatch, please, computer?" said Zaphod, trying not to get angry.
"Not until whoever said that owns up,"
urged the computer, stamping a few synapses closed. "Oh God," muttered Ford. He slumped against a bulkhead and started to count to 10. He was desperately worried that one day sentient life forms would forget how to do this. Only by counting could humans demonstrate their independence of computers.
"Come on,"
said Eddie sternly. "Computer," began Zaphod.
"I'm waiting," interrupted Eddie. "I can wait all day if necessary."
"Computer," said Zaphod again, who had been trying to think of some subtle piece of reasoning to put the computer down with, and had decided not to bother competing with it on its own ground. "If you don't open that exit hatch this moment, I shall zap straight off to your major databanks and reprogram you with a very large axe. Got that?" Eddie, shocked, paused and considered this. Ford carried on counting quietly. This is about the most aggressive thing you can do to a computer, the equivalent of going up to a human being and saying, "Blood, blood, blood, blood." Finally, Eddie said quietly,
"I can see this relationship is something we're all going to have to work at."
And the hatchway opened. An icy wind ripped into them. They hugged themselves warmly and stepped down the ramp onto the barren dust of Magrathea.
"It'll all end in tears, I know it,"
shouted Eddie after them and closed the hatchway again. A few minutes later he opened and closed the hatchway again in response to a command that caught him entirely by surprise. 5 figures wandered slowly over the blighted land. Bits of it were dullish grey, bits of it dullish brown, the rest of it rather less interesting to look at. It was like a dried-out marsh, now barren of all vegetation and covered with a layer of dust about an inch thick. It was very cold. Zaphod was clearly rather depressed about it. He stalked off by himself and was soon lost to sight behind a slight rise in the ground. The wind stung Arthur's eyes and ears, and the stale thin air clasped his throat. However, the thing that was stung most was his mind. "It's fantastic," he said, and his own voice rattled his ears. Sound carried badly in this thin atmosphere. "Desolate hole, if you ask me," said Ford. "I could have more fun in a cat litter." He felt a mounting irritation. Of all the planets in all the star systems of all the galaxy, many wild and exotic, seething with life, didn't he just have to end up at a dump like this after 15 years of being a castaway? Not even a hot dog stand in evidence. He stooped down and picked up a cold clod of earth, but there was nothing underneath it worth crossing thousands of light years to look at. "No," insisted Arthur. "Don't you understand? This is the first time I've actually stood on the surface of another planet. A whole alien world. Pity it's such a dump, though." Trillian hugged herself, shivered and frowned. She could have sworn she saw a slight and unexpected movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she glanced in that direction all she could see was the ship, still and silent, 100 yards or so behind them. She was relieved when a second or so later they caught sight of Zaphod standing on top of the ridge of ground and waving to them to come and join him. He seemed to be very excited, but they couldn't clearly hear what he was saying because of the thinnish atmosphere and the wind. As they approached the ridge of higher ground they became aware that it seemed to be circular, a crater about 150 yards wide. Round the outside of the crater the sloping ground was splattered with black and red lumps. They stopped and looked at a piece. It was wet. It was rubbery. With horror they suddenly realized that it was fresh whale meat. At the top of the crater's lip they met Zaphod. "Look," he said, pointing into the crater. In the centre lay the exploded carcass of a lonely sperm whale that hadn't lived long enough to be disappointed with its lot. The silence was only disturbed by the slight involuntary spasms of Trillian's throat. "I suppose there's no point in trying to bury it," murmured Arthur, and then wished he hadn't. "Come," said Zaphod, and started back down into the crater. "What, down there?" said Trillian with severe distaste. "Yeah," said Zaphod. "Come on, I've got something to show you." "We can see it," said Trillian. "Not that." "Come on," insisted Zaphod. "I've found a way in." "In?" said Arthur with horror. "Into the interior of the planet. An underground passage. The force of the whale's impact cracked it open. That's where we have to go. Where no man has trod these 5 million years. Into the very depths of time itself." Marvin started his ironical humming again. Zaphod hit him and he shut up. With little shudders of disgust they all followed Zaphod down the incline into the crater, trying very hard to avoid looking at its unfortunate creator. "Life," said Marvin dolefully. "Loathe it or ignore it. You can't like it." The ground had caved in where the whale had hit it, revealing a network of galleries and passageways, now largely obstructed by collapsed rubble and entrails. Zaphod had made a start clearing a way into one of them, but Marvin was able to do it faster. Dank air wafted out of its dark recesses, and as Zaphod shone a torch into it, little was visible in the dusty gloom. "According to the legends," he said, "the Magratheans live most of their lives underground." "Why is that?" said Arthur. "Did the surface become too polluted or overpopulated?" "No, I don't think so," said Zaphod. "I think they just didn't like it very much." "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" said Trillian, peering nervously into the darkness. "We've been attacked once already, you know." "Look, kid, I promise you the live population of this planet is 0 plus the 4 of us. So come on, let's get on in there. Hey, Earthman." "Arthur," said Arthur. Yeah, could you just sort of keep this robot with you and guard this end of the passageway, okay?" "Guard?" said Arthur. "What from? You just said there's no one here." "Well, just for safety, okay?" said Zaphod. "Whose, yours or mine?" "Good lad. Okay, here we go." Zaphod scrambled down into the passage, followed by Trillian and Ford. "Well, I hope you all have a really miserable time. complained Arthur. "Don't worry," Marvin assured him. "They will." In a few seconds they'd disappeared from view. Arthur stamped around in a huff, and then decided that a whale's graveyard is not on the whole a good place to stamp around in. Marvin eyed him balefully for a moment, and then turned himself off. Zaphod marched quickly down the passageway, nervous as hell but trying to hide it by striding purposefully. He flung the torch beam around. The walls were covered in dark tiles and were cold to the touch, the air thick with decay. At intervals along the walls, the tiles gave way to large mosaics, simple angular patterns in bright colours. Trillian stopped and studied one of them, but couldn't interpret any sense in them. She called to Zaphod. "Hey, have you any idea what these strange symbols are?" "I think they're just strange symbols of some kind," said Zaphod, hardly glancing back. Trillian shrugged and hurried after him. From time to time a doorway led either to the left or right, into smallish chambers, which Ford discovered to be full of derelict computer equipment. He dragged Zaphod into one to have a look. Trillian followed. "Look," said Ford. "You reckon this is Magrathea?" "Yeah," said Zaphod. "And we heard the voice, right?" "Okay, so I've bought the fact that it's Magrathea, for the moment, but what you've so far said nothing about is how in the galaxy you found it. You didn't just look it up in a star atlas, that's for sure." "Research, government archives, detective work, few lucky guesses, easy." "And then you stole the heart of gold to come and look for it with." "I stole it to look for a lot of things." "A lot of things," said Ford in surprise. "Like what?" "I don't know." "What?" "I don't know what I'm looking for." "Why not?" "Because I think it might be because if I knew, I wouldn't be able to look for them." "What, are you crazy?" At that moment a steel shutter slammed down behind them, and gas started to pour into the chamber. "I'll tell you about it later," choked Zaphod as all three passed out. On the surface of Magrathea, Arthur wandered about moodily. The robot sat there, completely inert. Arthur got up and walked to the top of the crater. He watched two suns set magnificently over Magrathea. He went back into the crater. He woke the robot up, because even a manically depressed robot is better to talk to than nobody. "Night's falling," he said. "Look, robot, the stars are coming out." The robot obediently looked at them, then looked back. "I know," he said. "Wretched, isn't it?" "But that sunset! I've never seen anything like it in my wildest dreams. The two suns. It was like mountains of fire boiling into space." "I've seen it," said Marvin. "It's rubbish." "We only ever had the one sun at home," persevered Arthur. "I came from a planet called Earth, you know." "I know," said Marvin. "You keep going on about it. It sounds awful." "Oh no, it was a beautiful place." "Did it have oceans?" "Oh yes," said Arthur with a sigh. "Great wide rolling blue oceans." "Can't bear oceans," said Marvin. "Tell me," inquired Arthur, "do you get on well with other robots?" "Hate them," said Marvin. "Where are you going?" Arthur couldn't bear any more. He'd got up again. "I think I'll just take another walk," he said. "Don't blame you," said Marvin, and counted 597,000 million sheep before falling asleep again a second later. Arthur slapped his arms about himself to try and get his circulation a little more enthusiastic about its job. He trudged back up the wall of the crater. Because the atmosphere was so thin, and because there was no moon, nightfall was very rapid, and it was by now very dark. Because of this, Arthur practically walked into the old man before he noticed him. He was standing with his back to Arthur, watching the very last glimmers of light sink into the blackness behind the horizon. He was tallish, elderly, and dressed in a single long grey robe. When he turned, his face was thin and distinguished, careworn but not unkind, the sort of face you'd happily bank with. But he didn't turn yet, not even to react to Arthur's yelp of surprise. Eventually the last rays of sun had vanished completely, and he turned. His face was still illuminated from somewhere, and when Arthur looked for the source of the light, he saw that a few yards away stood a small craft of some kind. A small hovercraft, Arthur guessed. It shed a dim pool of light around it. The man looked at Arthur, sadly it seemed. "You choose a cold night to visit our dead planet," he said. Who are you?" stammered Arthur. The man looked away. Again a look of sadness seemed to cross his face. "My name is not important," he said. He seemed to have something on his mind. Conversation was clearly something he felt he didn't have to rush at. Arthur felt awkward. You startled me," he said lamely. The man looked round to him again and slightly raised his eyebrows. "Do not be alarmed, I will not harm you." Arthur frowned at him. "But you shot at us, there were missiles," he said. The man chuckled slightly. "An automatic system," he said, and gave a small sigh. "Ancient computers ranged in the bowels of the planet tick away the dark millennia, and the ages hang heavy on their dusty databanks. I think they take the occasional pot shot to relieve the monotony." He looked gravely at Arthur and said, "I'm a great fan of science, you know." "Oh, really?" said Arthur, who was beginning to find the man's curious, kindly manner disconcerting. "Oh, yes," said the old man, and simply stopped talking again. "Ah," said Arthur. "You seem ill at ease," said the old man with polite concern. No, well, yes. Actually, you see, we weren't really expecting to find anybody about, in fact. I sort of gathered that you were all dead or something." "Dead?" said the old man. "Good gracious me, no, we have but slept." "Slept?" said Arthur incredulously. "Yes, through the economic recession, you see," said the old man, apparently unconcerned about whether Arthur understood a word he was talking about or not. "Well, you see, 5 million years ago the galactic economy collapsed, and seeing that custom-built planets are something of a luxury commodity, you see—" He paused and looked at Arthur. "You know we built planets, do you?" he asked solemnly. "Well, yes," said Arthur, "I'd sort of gathered." "Fascinating trade," said the old man, and a wistful look came into his eyes. "Doing the coastlines was always my favourite. Used to have endless fun doing the little bits in fjords. So anyway," he said, trying to find his thread again, "the recession came, and we decided it would save a lot of bother if we just slept through it. So we programmed the computers to revive us when it was all over." The man stifled a very slight yawn and continued. "The computers were index-linked to the galactic stock market prices, you see, so that we'd all be revived when everybody else had rebuilt the economy enough to afford our rather expensive services." Arthur, a regular Guardian reader, was deeply shocked at this. "That's a pretty unpleasant way to behave, isn't it?" "Is it?" asked the old man mildly. "I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of touch." He pointed down into the crater. "Is that robot yours?" he said. "No," came a thin metallic voice from the crater. "I'm mine." "If you'd call it a robot," muttered Arthur. "It's more a sort of electronic sulking machine." "Bring it," said the old man. Arthur was quite surprised to hear a note of decision suddenly present in the old man's voice. He called to Marvin, who crawled up the slope, making a big show of being lame, which he wasn't. "On second thoughts," said the old man, "leave it here. You must come with me. Great things are afoot." He turned towards his craft, which, though no apparent signal had been given, now drifted quietly towards them through the dark. Arthur looked down at Marvin, who now made an equally big show of turning round laboriously and trudging off down into the crater again, muttering sour nothings to himself. "Come," called the old man. "Come now, or you will be late." "Late?" said Arthur. "What for?" "What is your name, human?" "Dent. Arthur Dent," said Arthur. "Late, as in the late Dent Arthur Dent," said the old man sternly. "It's a sort of threat, you see. I've never been very good at them myself, but I'm told they can be very effective." Arthur blinked at him. "What an extraordinary person," he muttered to himself. "I beg your pardon," said the old man. "Oh, nothing, sorry," said Arthur in embarrassment. The man motioned Arthur to get into the craft which had settled silently next to them. "We are going deep into the bowels of the planet, where even now our race is being revived from its 5 million-year slumber. Magrathea awakes." Arthur shivered involuntarily as he seated himself next to the old man. The strangeness of it, the silent bobbing movement of the craft as it soared into the night sky, quite unsettled him. He looked at the old man, his face illuminated by the dull glow of tiny lights on the instrument panel. "Excuse me," he said to him, "what is your name, by the way?" "My name," said the old man, and the same distant sadness came into his face again. He paused. "My name," he said, "is Slarty Bartfast." Arthur practically choked. "I beg your pardon," he spluttered. "Slarty Bartfast," repeated the old man quietly. "Slarty Bartfast?" The old man looked at him gravely. "I said it wasn't important," he said. The air car sailed through the night. It is an important and popular fact that things are not always what they seem. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on. Whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water having a good time. But conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were more intelligent than man for precisely the same reasons. Curiously enough, the dolphins had long known of the impending destruction of the planet Earth, and had made many attempts to alert mankind to the danger, but most of their communications were misinterpreted as amusing attempts to punch footballs or whistle for titbits, so they eventually gave up and left the Earth by their own means shortly before the Vogons arrived. The last ever dolphin message was misinterpreted as a surprisingly sophisticated attempt to do a double backwards somersault through a hoop whilst whistling the Star-Spangled Banner, but in fact the message was this: "So long, and thanks for all the fish." In fact, there was only one species on the planet more intelligent than dolphins, and they spent a lot of their time in behavioural research laboratories, running round inside wheels and conducting frighteningly elegant and subtle experiments on man. The fact that once again man completely misinterpreted this relationship was entirely according to these creatures' plans. Silently the air car coasted through the cold darkness, a single soft glow of light that was utterly alone in the deep Magrathean night. It sped swiftly. Arthur's companion seemed sunk in his own thoughts, and when Arthur tried on a couple of occasions to engage him in conversation again, he would simply reply by asking if he was comfortable enough, and then left it at that. Then a tiny glow of light appeared in the far distance, and within seconds had grown so much in size that Arthur realised it was travelling towards them at a colossal speed, and he tried to make out what sort of craft it might be. He peered at it, but was unable to discern any clear shape, and suddenly gasped in alarm as the air car dipped sharply and headed downwards in what seemed certain to be a collision course. The next thing he was aware of was an insane silver blur that seemed to surround him. He twisted his head sharply round, and saw a small black point dwindling rapidly in the distance behind them, and it took him several seconds to realise what had happened. They had plunged into a tunnel in the ground. The colossal speed had been their own relative to the glow of light, which was a stationary hole in the ground, the mouth of the tunnel. The insane blur of silver was the circular wall of the tunnel down which they were shooting, apparently at several 100 miles an hour. He closed his eyes in terror. After a length of time which he made no attempt to judge, he sensed a slight subsidence in their speed, and some while later became aware that they were gradually gliding to a gentle halt. He opened his eyes again. They were still in the silver tunnel, threading and weaving their way through what appeared to be a criss-cross warren of converging tunnels. When they finally stopped, it was in a small chamber of curved steel, and at the farther end of the chamber Arthur could see a large circle of dim, irritating light. It was irritating because it played tricks with his eyes. It was impossible to focus on it properly or tell how near or far it was. Slarty Bartfast turned and regarded Arthur with his solemn old eyes. "Earthman," he said, We are now deep in the heart of Magrathea." "How did you know I was an Earthman?" demanded Arthur. "These things will become clear to you," said the old man gently. "At least, clearer than they are at the moment. I should warn you that the chamber we are about to pass into does not literally exist within our planet. We are about to pass through a gateway into a vast tract of hyperspace. It may disturb you." Arthur made nervous noises. Slarty Bartfast touched a button and added, not entirely reassuringly, "It scares the willies out of me." "Hold tight." The car shot forward straight into the circle of light, and suddenly Arthur had a fairly clear idea of what infinity looked like. Arthur's senses bobbed and span as, travelling at the immense speed he knew the air car attained, they climbed slowly through the open air, leaving the gateway through which they had passed an invisible pinprick in the shimmering wall behind them. The wall defied the imagination. The wall was so paralysingly vast and sheer that its top, bottom and sides passed away beyond the reach of sight. The mere shock of vertigo could kill a man. It formed the inside of a hollow sphere, a sphere over 3 million miles across and flooded with unimaginable light. "Welcome," said Slarty Bartfast as the tiny speck that was the air car, travelling now at 3 times the speed of sound, crept imperceptibly forward into the mind-boggling space. "Welcome," he said, "to our factory floor. This is where we make most of our planets, you see." "You mean," said Arthur, trying to form the words, "you're starting it all up again now?" "No, no, good heavens, no," exclaimed the old man. "No, the galaxy isn't nearly rich enough to support us yet. No, we've been awakened to perform just one extraordinary commission for very special clients from another dimension. It may interest you. There, in the distance in front of us." Arthur followed the old man's finger till he was able to pick out the floating structure he was pointing out. For a few seconds he sat in stunned silence as the images rushed around his mind and tried to find somewhere to settle down and make sense. Part of his brain told him that he knew perfectly well what he was looking at, whilst another quite sensibly refused to countenance the idea and abdicated responsibility for any further thinking in that direction. "The Earth," whispered Arthur. "Well, the Earth Mark II, in fact," said Slarty Bartfast cheerfully. "We're making a copy from our original blueprints." There was a pause. "Are you trying to tell me," said Arthur, slowly and with control, "that you originally made the Earth?" "Oh yes," said Slarty Bartfast. "Did you ever go to a place, I think it was called Norway?" "No," said Arthur. "No, I didn't." "Pity," said Slarty Bartfast. "That was one of mine. Won an award, you know. Lovely crinkly edges. I was most upset to hear of its destruction." "You were upset?" "Yes, 5 minutes later and it wouldn't have mattered so much. It was a quite shocking cock-up. The mice were furious." "The mice were furious?" "Oh yes," said the old man mildly. "Yes, well, so I expect were the dogs and cats and duck-billed platypuses, but—" "Ah, but they hadn't paid for it, you see, had they?" "Look," said Arthur, "would it save you a lot of time if I just gave up and went mad now?" For a while the air car flew on in awkward silence. Then the old man tried patiently to explain. "Earthman, the planet you lived on was commissioned, paid for, and run by mice. It was destroyed 5 minutes before the completion of the purpose for which it was built, and we've got to build another one." Only one word was registering with Arthur. "Mice!" he said. "Indeed, Earthman. Look, sorry, are we talking about the little white furry things with the cheese fixation and women standing on tables screaming in early 60s sitcoms?" Slarty Bartfast coughed politely. "Earthman," he said, "it is sometimes hard to follow your mode of speech. Remember, I have been asleep inside this planet of Magrathea for 5 million years, and know little of these early 60s sitcoms of which you speak. These creatures you call mice, you see, They are not quite as they appear. They are merely the protrusion into our dimension of vast, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. The whole business with the cheese and the squeaking is just a front." The old man paused, and with a sympathetic frown continued, "They've been experimenting on you, I'm afraid." Arthur thought about this for a moment, and then his face cleared. "Ah, no," he said. "I see the source of the misunderstanding now. No, look, you see, what happened was that we used to do experiments on them, learning to ring bells, run round mazes and things, so that the whole nature of the learning process could be examined. From our observations of their behaviour, we were able to learn all sorts of things about our own." Arthur's voice tailed off. "Such subtlety," said Slarty Bartfast. "One has to admire it." "What?" said Arthur. "How better to disguise their real natures, and how better to guide your thinking. Suddenly running down a maze the wrong way, eating the wrong bit of cheese, unexpectedly dropping dead of myxomatosis. If it's finely calculated, the cumulative effect is enormous." He paused for effect. "You see, Earthman, they really are particularly clever, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. Your planet and people have formed the matrix of an organic computer running a 10-million-year research program. Let me tell you the whole story. It'll take a little time." "Time," said Arthur weakly, "is not currently one of my problems.